The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. The Lord continued, Do not say, I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched Jeremiah's mouth and said, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant.
I'm Jeremiah. I'm the son of Hilkiah, who is a priest in Anathoth, in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin. And as most things happen in those days, me being the son, I was going to follow in my father's footsteps and become a priest. So the word of the Lord came to me around halfway through King Josiah's reign. King Josiah was a good king, even by God's standards. He restored good worship to the temple in Jerusalem. He got rid of worship of false gods and temples and idols scattered across the country. But as in life, all good things must come to an end. And King Josiah died during battle. And this was about 12 years into my time as a prophet. And about the same time, the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and became the dominant power in that region. Things started going downhill from there, as I'm sure many of you read, and the rest is history.
Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. And whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious people, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them, though they are rebellious people. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious.
I'm Ezekiel. I was a priest in Israel during one of the worst times in Hebrew history. After the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians and became the dominant power, they started attacking the Jews in Jerusalem and harassing, and through a series of events took various people among the Hebrews into exile back to Babylon. And then eventually, in a time after I had started prophesying for God, after his call, they came and they wiped out the whole city of Jerusalem. Now, it was probably the second exile when the Babylonians came and took leaders, religious leaders, royalty, and some of the well-educated back to Babylon. I was in that bunch. And that's about when I started hearing God's call. 5 years into the exile, God called me to be a prophet, to speak his words to God's people. My name means God strengthens, but I didn't feel very strong, honestly, when I was giving God's message. Now, the role of a prophet is to hear God speak. Oftentimes it comes in a vision or a dream, and God says, Son of man, mortal. That's what he called me. It means human being. Go and tell my people. And I would go and say, Thus says the Lord. But there are times that God did something different. God would come to me and he would say, instead of talking to the people, I want you to do something I want you to act out my message to the people. Jeremiah, did God ever ask you to do anything odd?
You have no idea. So this one time, he says to me, I want you to go out and buy a nice linen belt, similar to the one I'm wearing now. And I'm thinking, well, that makes sense. That's a good plan, God. You want your prophet to be well-dressed. People would respect a man who looks good and looks the part. So I go out, I buy a nice belt. I'm walking around town feeling good, not getting too high, but, feeling good. God says, okay, go out into the wilderness. Where are you going with this, God? But, okay, I'm prophet, I follow. I go out in the wilderness, take the belt off, bury it under a rock. Spent a lot of money. This is a nice belt. Had I known that's where this was going, I may not have done that much. But I did it. I obeyed. I went back to the city, a little bit more downtrodden. And a couple days later, God's like, hey, Jeremiah, why don't you remember that belt I had you go get and then bury? You know, the one that I really, really liked? Yeah, I remember that one. He said, go dig it up. So I go all the way back out there, and I dig it up, and as anybody could have guessed, it's a linen belt, and I buried it in the dirt. It was ruined. It was completely destroyed. God says to me, that's the point. The belt symbolizes the Israelites. And they started as something beautiful and valuable. And because of their sin and disobeying me, they've become ruined and useless and destroyed. It was a good message, but it was kind of an odd way of doing it, in my opinion. Did he ever ask you to do anything odd?
Oh, you better believe it. Lots of times. But maybe my favorite, at least the one that I really remember, was the time that he told me to get this big block of clay and to take the block of clay and to put it in front of me, and then I was to start to draw on the clay. And I was drawing the city of Jerusalem. I was making a model of the city with the walls around it and all of the people. And then God told me to start laying siege to the city, to take battering rams and to lay them against the city, and to take soldiers that I learned would be the Babylonians, and to have them attacking the city, sieging the city, to put ramps against the city, all the while. But then God told me, after I'd built the model of the clay city and the siege, God told me to turn, lay on my left side, facing the city, watching the siege, and to just lay there for 390 days. One day for each year of Israel's sin. Then, after 390 days, the Lord told me to turn over on the other side and to lay there for another 40 days. 1 year for each of the tribe of Judah's sins, each year of their sins.
That sounds rough. But minus the, laying on your side for a year, that's actually pretty fun. I can see me and my son doing that, getting together, building a model of the city, and playing army guys. I think we'd have a good time. Except I didn't have a son. God forbade me from marrying or having children at all. Which, as you know, no children to carry on the legacy, to take care of you when you're older. It was to symbolize the destruction that was going to come, and there would be no more families, there would be no more marrying and happy, joyful occasions. But that was one of the loneliest parts of my calling.
Wow. I can only imagine. At least God allowed me to marry and to have children. I had a delightful wife. She was beautiful. And she died. God told me that I wasn't allowed to mourn. I couldn't be part of the ceremonies that widowers usually go through. I couldn't cry. I couldn't say sad words. I couldn't even go to the mourning feast.
That's rough. That's really rough. I wasn't married, but I wasn't allowed to go to the mourning feast of anybody that I knew. And I knew a lot of people. I wasn't allowed to do any of those same things, any of the rituals. I wasn't allowed to participate or even demonstrate that I was sad. And although that's not the same thing as your own wife, I bet you that the faces of the people who were questioning why you didn't seem to care about their loved ones, I bet the accusing eyes were the same for you and me. And I still have dreams about those sometimes. But I even had the opposite problem. You know, mourning is one thing. I wasn't allowed to take part in celebration feasts, wedding feasts, good times. I couldn't enjoy food or parties or anything. I had to sit there, sullen and unhappy.
Let me tell you about miserable eating. You remember when I was lying down on my side for 390 days and then 340 days on the other side and looking at the siege? God told me to take a mash of stuff, some wheat and some barley, some beans and some lentils, millet and smelt, and put it all in a big jar and just set it aside to rot and decay. And I was to take out a portion, a measured amount each day as I'm laying on my side, and to put it in like what God called maybe a barley loaf, make bread out of it. But that nasty mash that I put together, God told me to bake it over dried manure. God, I've never defiled myself like this. Why are you asking me to do this? Why, God?
Son of man, I will make food very scarce in Jerusalem. It will be weighed out with great care and eaten fearfully. The water will be rationed out drop by drop, and the people will drink it with dismay. Lacking food and water, people will look at one another in terror, and they will waste away under their punishment.
I kind of understood, but not really. But even so, I obeyed God. I laid on my side, I ate the defiled bread. But the strangest thing of all, that the whole time I'm laying there, my hands and my feet were bound.
What? That is. I really hope that God has some chiropractors up here, because that sounds awful. And what he had me do next was just as bad. Maybe not just as bad, that's pretty bad, but it was rough. So he had me build a yoke, much like this stick right here. I built one for me, and I built one for the kings and the princes and all the surrounding kingdoms. And then I sent them away to them. And this would symbolize the coming yoke of the Babylonians, who were going to take over everything. And then it was my role to go around Israel and tell people all of that, to tell people that the Babylonians were coming and they were going to destroy us. It was set in stone, preordained. There was nothing they could do about it. So I got into a debate this one time with a false prophet named Hananiah, and he went around preaching peace and victory. While God had ordained destruction, he ran around speaking out against them. And so imagine this scene. He's down here, he's charismatic, he's a great speaker, going around telling everybody that salvation is coming. God's going to save us. And I'm up here with the yoke on, saying, no, don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So I was like this, having this debate with this guy as he's prophesying salvation and I'm prophesying destruction. And he comes over and he takes the yoke off and he breaks it and throws it down. And he says, this is to symbolize that the yoke of the Babylonians is going to be broken and God's going to save us. My neck thanked him, and, it was a pretty dramatic scene, but I had to tell him. I looked him in the eye and I said, the prophecy of a prophet and the accuracy is what determines if they are real or false. And I told him, I prophesy that because you are lying to these people, you will be dead soon. And the Babylonians are going to destroy us all. He prophesied peace and salvation. But unfortunately for him, my prophecies came true. And that was one of the hardest parts of being a prophet. That these were my people, this was my country. And I had to go around telling them that we are going to be destroyed. And it's not just destroyed, it was because of us, but because of our sins and our repeated disobeying of God, that we were all going to be destroyed, and the city and God's temple, everything gone. They didn't want to hear, of course, because nobody wants to hear that it's their own fault. But unfortunately for them, my prophecies came true.
They never do want to hear bad news. God had me act out bad news they didn't want to hear. There was the time that God told me to pack up like I was going on a long trip. He called it an exile pack. Take everything that belonged to me that I'd need for a trip. And I was to take my pack out of my house and to walk around the city in the daylight so that everybody could see me packed for exile. And then I was to go back into the house after everybody had seen me. And when it came nighttime, at dusk as the sun's going down, I'm to take the pack back out and go to the walls of the city with it on my shoulder and to start digging with my hands against the walls of the city. Digging a hole and then crawling through the hole to represent the prince in Jerusalem going into exile. And as I got up, after crawling through the wall with my pack on, I had a blindfold, so I couldn't see. So that as the prince left the city, he could no longer see the land God had given them. Oh, God, why do you have me do these things? Why don't you just come and let me preach, give your word, thus says the Lord, like you usually do?
One of the things that my people often didn't get was how much I wanted their worship to be really sincere, not just done for ritual one day a week while they went about doing what they pleased the other 6 days. As I told them through Moses when they were getting ready to go into the land that I promised, You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. They didn't get that I wanted themselves, all of their being, not just empty words and religious practices. So I told my prophets, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and others, to act out my words with their bodies, my words coming alive in their flesh, a visual sign of when I would come to earth in human form as my son Jesus, my word in the flesh, to live with them.
One of the oddest things that God had me do took place during the siege. Now, you may not know this, you may. One of the consequences of following God is that sometimes people don't like what you have to say. And in this case, the king of the Israelites had imprisoned me during the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. You see, I had been going around telling people that we were going to lose. The Babylonians were going to take over the city. That's what God told me. And I've been telling them this for years. It was nothing new. But, for some reason, morale problems or what have you, people didn't like that message. And so the king imprisoned me. He locked me in a courtyard in the palace. And while I was there, God came to me and said, send for your cousin. So I went, sent for my cousin, came in. God said, he's got a field outside of the city, and I want you to go buy it. The city's being besieged, God. There's probably Babylonians camping in that field. Why would I buy a field? It makes no sense whatsoever. But here's the beautiful thing. Throughout our long careers as a prophet, callings as a prophet, God had us act out a lot of weird things to symbolize the sins of Israel and the coming destruction. But this was the first thing that I got to do to symbolize what comes next. You see, there was sin, and because of our sin, the Babylonians were coming. And that sin was punished. But the punishment wouldn't last forever. The field was to symbolize that there would be houses sold again, that there would be fields and vineyards sold again. The destruction would be awful and devastating, but the land would be restored because God is ever merciful and he loves his people, and he was going to restore us to prosperity. And so I bought a field in the middle of a war zone to symbolize that it would not always be a war zone. A field may get burned down with fire, but flowers will grow back stronger and more beautiful than ever. And one of the last things that God had me do, and it was the strangest thing of all, was to give people hope when everything around seemed hopeless.
I told my people in many words and in many ways that even when I was upset, I don't stay angry at them forever. And whenever I punished them, I always forgave them, even when they didn't deserve it. I assured them over and over that I would never leave them or forsake them. They never got it, so I had to do something really wild and wacky. I chose to come to earth as a little baby and to live as a human being in the middle of my human creations. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is to give real hope to my people. As I said through Jesus, as he was about to come back to heaven, I am with you always, even to the end of time.